Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Peter Mitchell, Councillor for Woodside and Chair of Corporate Committee. Welcome to this meeting on 16th November. I think it would be best to start by going around the room and introducing ourselves. So can I suggest we go in a clockwise direction?
Aisha Simsek, Democratic Services and Scrutiny Manager.
Fiona Ray, Principal Committee Coordinator.
Councillor Demir, West Green Councillor.
Councillor Joseph Ejiofor, Bruce Grove Ward.
Councillor Mark Blake, Woodside.
Councillor Tab Ward, Tottenham Green.
Councillor Amina Ibrahim, Labour Councillor for Knoll Park Ward.
Councillor Berryman.
Councillor Dawn Barnes, Crouch End.
Councillor Kaushika Amin, representing Northumberland Park Ward.
Councillor Daldogan, Seven Sisters Ward.
Raymond Prince, Head of Legal Services and Deputy Monitoring Officer.
Minesh Jani, Head of Audit and Risk Management.
Thank you very much. And we will have other officers joining us remotely, and they can introduce themselves as and when we get to those items. Item 2 is apologies for absence. I've got apologies from Councillor Emery. Are there any other apologies?
There are no further apologies, Chair.
Thank you. Item 3, urgent business. None so far.
Yes, Chair. We've just got some. We've got the items which are on the agenda in relation to the decision making on Alex House, which was we've got a late business sheet, and also some additional papers that have been tabled, which are relating to item 7.
Thank you. So that brings us to item 4, declarations of interest. Do members have any declarations of interest or conflicts of interest to declare?
I'm assuming that following on from advice from the monitoring officer, that is no on our behalf.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the last bit of your query.
Just following on from advice from the monitoring officer, I understand that I do not have a conflict of interest.
If that advice applies to you, Councillor, that's correct. You have no declaration to declare.
Thank you. So that brings us to item 5, deputations, petitions, presentations, questions. Don't believe there are any, is there?
That's correct, Chair. We have no deputations, petitions or questions.
So item 6 is the minutes of the meeting that took place on the 9th of September. Are those agreed as a correct record? Okay, yeah, thank you. So that brings us to item 7, which starts on page 9, which is the review of polling districts, polling places, and designation of a polling scheme. So can I invite, I think it's Mark Stevens who's going to introduce this item.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, everybody. I'm Mark Stevens, Assistant Director, Direct Services and Project Sponsor. Thank you for this evening. In terms of the paper before you, it relates to the Local Government Boundary Commission for England review of the borough's ward boundaries and what we've had to do since as a project team. The Boundary Commission started its work in July 2018, concluded with recommendations in December 2019, and Parliament agreed in October 2020 that Haringey should revise to 21 wards rather than the current 19, but actually retain 57 council members. With the changes to all the ward boundaries, the projects team's task is to create a polling scheme for the borough by reviewing the polling districts and the polling places for the new wards. Our work has been overseen by a member working group, and for those who participated in that, I thank them, and also input from an officer working group as well. Nearly 90 visits were carried out to venues across the borough in coming up with an arrangement that's fit to take to consultation. The consultation commenced on the 31st of August, including an all-member briefing that evening. It also included 3 drop-in sessions for members and the public, and respondents had the options to reply by post, email or web form. While some members of the briefing on the 31st of August thought we were just going through the motions, I can assure you this was a genuine consultation that has resulted in changes. And the proposal presented to the committee this evening is for 73 polling districts and polling places. In addition, there are 3 sub-districts where the parliamentary constituencies cut through wards, and these sub-districts appear in Stroud Green, West Green and Woodside. The proposed district boundary aligns with where White Hart Lane is split, and assuming that the parliamentary boundaries are realigned with the parliamentary constituency review in 2023, the adjustments to the proposed scheme will be minor and straightforward at that stage. Subject to the committee approving the recommendations in the report, the next stages following the meeting are to upload the new wards and polling districts into the system, and this is going to require a lot of checking and testing, publishing the background information to the consultation, finalise the bookings for the polling places for the May 2022 elections, and prepare and run an extensive communication plan to ensure that electors are informed of the changes in polling places and that they have been told where their polling place is. We know that between now and May 2022, circumstances will change. Some suggested polling places may not become available, but that is where the elections team will step in to arrange an alternative, as they would do for any election. There are some additional points that I wanted to flag up, one of which is the drawing, the layout plan that you have before you, showing the new districts. Our apologies for the fact this wasn't in the original pack, but this is where we've actually looked at re-looked at the designation of the wards and identified that there should be some minor amendments where the lines for the boundaries of those pass through 2 parks, and they affect Alexander Park 3 and B and Alexander Park C, as well as Woodside Area A and Woodside Area B. And they should be in the PDF, and it demonstrates in terms of the red line was where the marking used to be for the ward boundary. It's actually now moving to the green line. In the report, we also said that we were still working with St Michael's Highgate, and we've finally managed to speak to them, and they've managed to arrange to close the school for May 2022 elections using one of their flexible days, and we'll look at options for using a different space in the school in the future in order to try and keep it open. The only other thing I wanted to add was to extend my thanks to Gareth Harrington, Leslie Rennie and Kathy Kiriakou in terms of their support as part of the project team, doing the bulk of the work, it has to be said, in driving us to the point where the report is presented to you with its recommendations tonight for your consideration. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. I must say, having been on the member working group, that has been a very thorough exercise, and really appreciate that the officers put a lot of effort and a lot of time in visiting all the polling stations and all the suggestions that were made by others for alternative venues. So are there any questions from members of the committee? Councillor Ejiofor.
Thank you, Chair. Just working my way through this list, it does seem to be a number of differences between some of the larger polling areas with 2,500, for example, properties, and some of the smaller polling areas. And I noticed we started off with 83, was it? 86? No, 83 districts, and we've come down to 76. Is there a particular reason for retaining some really large districts?
Mr. Stevens, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that some of the sizes of the areas are geographically large because of the fact there's a lot of green space in there, for one thing. What we have tried to do is be fairly consistent with the number of electors in each of those areas. I've got colleagues on the call as well who may be able to add some more substance to that. But I think that some of those areas will be single polling stations as well as double polling stations. So whilst the area might look big, it's actually broken down within those areas for a number of different stations.
Thank you. Are there any further comments? Councillor Amin.
Can I just ask about Northumberland Park, which I know that one of my colleagues is not happy about, which is a split, which was the kind of, there were 2 polling stations and we've removed 1 polling station. So I was looking at the numbers for that polling station. The electoral count is 3,886, and then after planned development is 3. Still, obviously, there's no development there, but it's massive compared to, say, the one on, which is on 76, page 76, where the electoral count is 1173. I mean, some of them are big, actually really, really big. So I think I understand what my colleague is saying, although I, in the end, accepted that the 2 polling stations are far too close for it to have an effect. But I just wondered whether this still needs a further polling station for that area, for Northumberland Park Ward. It's massive, it just is very big.
Okay, thanks. Are there any? So I note on page 214 raises the alternative suggestions and comments on those. Is there anything more to add, Mr. Stevens?
Only to add that most of the land there is non-residential in that part of Northumberland Park on the east side. And the walking distances have been checked by the project team to make sure that they're not excessive. And we have actually worked overall. I think that the idea was to try and work between 2,500 and 3,500. So there are instances where it's slightly above that. But when you take into consideration postal voters and the area split into 2 polling stations and the venue, we think it's about right.
Thank you. Did you want to come back on that? No.
I agree that the officers have been in contact with us as councillors and have been very helpful and done the walking and checked all the distances. So that wasn't the issue. More, I think, the point that it's such a large polling station. But fine. Thank you.
Thanks. Hang on, I've got Councillor Amin. Councillor Ibrahim was indicating, sorry.
Yeah, my concerns were about the proposed or the polling stations for Knoll Park Ward. All 3 of them are quite close to each other. So you've got St Mark's Church and the school, which are literally across the road from each other, but dealing with different polling districts. And then you've got Wood Green Library, which isn't particularly further away, but then traditionally or historically there was a polling station at Shropshire Hall, and obviously because Shropshire Hall can't be used for that anymore, there was porta cabins that were being used, but people don't realise, because they're straight roads, how long the roads are on Knoll Park Estate. And while it may seem quite simple because it's like all the roads are interconnected and you don't feel like you're walking very far from one end of Gladstone Avenue to the other, is quite a distance, particularly for elderly residents. And I'm concerned that it appears that all of the polling stations, all 3 of them, are just clustered quite near each other. I mean, St Mark's and the school are literally next door, and the library is like 2-3 minutes further walk away.
Okay, thanks. I mean, I know we've been trying to move away from porta cabins where possible, and I think we've reduced the number, I think, to 4. Do you want to come back on the Knoll Park issue?
Yes, thank you, Chair. In terms of the locations, we've looked at Wood Green Library, we've looked at and added new, St Mark's as a new polling place, and we do recognise in the future there'll be further development there. So the likelihood is we'll actually have to identify a new polling place to actually meet demand. I believe that we've actually not been able to identify other suitable venues in the area, which is why we've actually stuck with what we've got at present, but hope to be able to identify an additional polling place if at all possible.
No, and I totally appreciate that. It's just I wanted that issue to be noted because I can't, in all honesty, say, right, here's a place that you should have gone to because there isn't one. It's because we can't use Shropshire Hall anymore, and it's a shame that all three of them are so close to each other.
Okay, thanks. Was it Councillor? No. Okay, Councillor Ejiofor.
Yeah, we've got this map. It would really have been quite helpful to have the polling places themselves actually shown on this map. I was going through the report. There are a number of situations where people will be able to see a polling station, but it's not their polling station. They're going to have to do this, 15, 20-minute walk to go, for example, all the way over to the other side of a polling district, whilst they can actually see a polling station for a neighbouring district. So to what extent are we trying to alleviate that? Because that's a common irritant for many people, where their walk is to their polling station is further than their walk to the nearest polling station. And I'd use, off the top of my head, TCLA as an example, FGRD also as an example.
I think certainly walking distance has been a factor in coming to these recommendations. Do you want to come back on that, Mr. Stevens?
Yes, thank you, Chair. What we've tried to do is make sure that we're sort of working at the West End at sort of a 12 to 15-minute walk time, based upon the information we've got from Transport for London in terms of their maps. It is challenging at times, and there will be instances in terms of where the ward boundaries lie, that you often have a polling station that's close to someone that, in actual fact, it isn't actually their ward, so they do need to go to another location. And that's just a matter of how it pans out, unfortunately. In terms of identifying the polling places, as I said, in some areas we have struggled to identify those, and some of them do end up being close to ward boundaries. But as I said in my introduction, the one thing that we will be doing is focusing very hard on the communications plan, making sure that we're actually sending out maps as part of the process for the next election to make it quite clear where people's polling station actually is. That's a significant piece of work in itself. I did mention earlier on the member working group, and whilst we have been obviously presenting our report and our summarisation to you this evening, the intention is that member working group continues in its role into the future, right the way through until just before we start the pre-election period, just to make sure that we've addressed as much of the communication elements as we possibly can, and make sure that that approach is robust as well.
Thank you. Councillor Ibrahim?
Yeah, obviously, I do think it would be useful to kind of continue having conversations about when I totally appreciate that, somebody who can't vote in a polling station that is not located in their ward. But I know from when I was previously represented Haringey ward, there was an issue with people who lived effectively in Finsbury Park. They lived opposite Finsbury Park station, and they had 3 or 4 polling stations nearby, whether it was in Stroud Greenwald or, alternatively Hackney, Islington. I'm not proposing joint borough kind of polling stations, but in effect for them to have voted in person, they would have had to have gotten the 29 bus or walked, or if they wanted to vote, at 9:30 at night, they would have had to walk in the dark through Finsbury Park to get to St Paul's Church. And I just think it's kind of situations like that where there has to be some kind of a bespoke solution for those people, even if it is just a box, which is at a, because obviously it's to do with the way you separate out the voting, even if it's a box for a small amount of people that are in that situation at a nearby polling station.
Thank you. I mean, clearly it's a challenging exercise when all the ward boundaries have changed, and it has been a huge task. And I know every effort has been made to accommodate all the suggestions that have been put forward, and to take into account issues like walking distance and the number of voters potentially at each polling station. If there are no further comments, is there anything you want to add, Mr.
Yes, thank you, Chair. It was just to really say that, you know, those circumstances are appreciated, and we have actually looked at locations outside of the borough to consider whether or not they're more appropriate. But in terms of the rules, the process is if you're able to identify a polling place within the ward, then that is what you should go to. The other thing I would actually stress is that as a result of COVID, there was a significant increase in the number of postal voters. And that obviously remains a valid option for those people who might otherwise have difficulty getting to their polling station once they receive clarification as to where it is relative to their home.
Thank you. Well, if there are no further questions, can I turn to the recommendations which are on page 9? So the 3 recommendations there. First is that the polling scheme describing the polling districts and the polling places for the 21 wards are agreed. So that's as set out in Appendix 1A and 1B. And also, can I add, I believe it's called Appendix 4, the A3 map that you've got as well, that we're approving that. The second recommendation just gives delegated authority to amend the scheme in the event that the name of a building were to change, or for a specific reason where it's strictly necessary for a particular election to change a polling place. And to note the third recommendation that any minor errors in transferring the maps can be corrected at a later stage. So are those recommendations agreed? Agreed? Yeah, thank you. So,
Chair,
yeah.
I was just going to say yes, but the only thing I was going to say that on delegated authority, which I'm not happy with, it should be in conjunction, if you like, with the local councillors, because it feels we actually were very lucky. We had really good input and ability to talk to the officers. So I think it would be good to have that in conjunction with the local councillors who are affected by it. Yeah, maybe that's better.
Yeah. Officers happy with consultation? I'm sure in practice they would be. I mean, what we're looking at here is exceptional circumstances, such as a building not being available when it comes to a particular election. So it wouldn't be a permanent change. It would be for a particular election where strictly necessary. I'm sure there would be consultation. Are we officers happy with that?
I think where there's an opportunity to identify something in advance, and then obviously we will work with ward councillors, but at the end of the day, there may well be a position where the returning officer does have to actually make a very quick decision, and sometimes it's not always practical and might not be appropriate politically to actually do it along those lines. So I think the recommendation as proposed is in keeping with what the Chief Executive believes is really appropriate. And as I said, you know, we'd be more than happy to talk in advance of that wherever possible. But the preference is for the recommendation to stand as is.
Okay, thank you. Are you happy with that that suggestion? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So, moving on to item 8, which is the external audit plan, which starts on page 217. And I believe the external auditor is here in person, so we'll just invite him in. So, joining us remotely is Casey Kegru, Head of Finance, Chief Accountant. Are you going to introduce the item and then we move to BDO?
Yes, Chair.
Okay, if you go ahead, Casey.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good evening, councillors and colleagues. My name is Casey Kegu. I'm the head of finance for housing and the chief accountant of the borough. The report you have before you updates you on the council's plan for the audit of the council statement of accounts 2020-21. Last time we were here at corporate committee, we presented a draft timeline of the audit, and it was agreed that we'll come back to this meeting with a full audit plan. So the plan you have there before you sets out the approach the auditors are going to take on this audit, the timeline and the key issues. And it also considers, it highlights the staffing requirement for the audit and the proposed audit fee. I'm going to hand over to David Eagles, who is the BDO lead partner on this audit, to talk us through the audit plan. But before I do that, I just want to quickly point out the last time we did mention that the deadline to conclude the audit as set out by the Accounts and Audit Regulation is the 30th of September. And just to note that it's only about 9% of local authorities met that deadline. So we're not alone in that journey, but we hope that with this audit plan, we'll be able to complete this audit swiftly. So on that note, I'll hand over to David to take us through the audit plan. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yes, welcome to David Eagles, who's the BDO engagement lead. So do you want to take us through your report, which starts on page 221 of the pack?
Thank you, and thank you for welcoming me here this evening. I'm obviously taking over from Lee Lloyd Thomas, my colleague, as engagement lead from this year, and I will be joined by Lucy Trevitt as the senior audit manager and Kerry Lynn, who will continue to be an assistant manager on the audit. So I'm just going to talk you through the highlights of the plan in your document pack today. Firstly, on page 224 of your pack, we've set out the materiality levels for the group, which I'll come on to in a minute, and also for the council as a standalone entity. Slight increases compared to last year, basically reflecting the increased gross spend for 2020-21. The figures we use are based upon the draft unaudited accounts, but we have used a similar sort of percentage of that gross spend to calculate these figures. The clearly trivial level, which is the level below which we wouldn't report anything to you, has remained the same as in previous years, so we have sort of a consistent rounded figure for that. To page, where are we? Sorry. Page 230 of your pack, we've set out at a fairly high level how we're looking at the various components within the group accounts. So clearly the most significant component, in fact the only significant component, is the council itself, and we'll be undertaking a full statutory audit for that. But for the three subsidiary entities which are sort of consolidated into the group accounts, largely we'll be relying upon analytical procedures undertaken by the direct audit team, although we will be receiving information from the statutory auditors where that's relevant, and we've quoted the auditors here. The timeline is set out on page 231, and we need to come back to that in a minute. But what I was going to do was just talk you through the significant risks which start on page 234. And I'm more than happy to take questions as we go through if that's helpful for people. The first is management override. This is the ability of management to basically override controls and manipulate sets of financial statements to tell a story which isn't really the true and fair view that we're trying to look at. So manipulating things to give either a more favourable or less favourable position based upon their particular motivations. It is a standard risk for all audits, not just for the councils here. We don't have a particularly heightened risk here, but it's something where we look at journals, which is how one would manipulate figures within the accounts by moving them from one place to another, and also estimates. So significant judgment areas where, again, we could potentially see some areas of manipulation. And we'll come on to those specific, or some of the more specific areas for estimation as we go through. Revenue recognition is actually a more corporate focused risk. It's a risk where management are recognising maybe more or less income than they should be recognising. It's not quite so much of an issue for public sector, but it is a pretty standard risk unless we can rebut that. And what we're saying is we can't. There are certain areas where we do think that there could be manipulation, and that focuses largely on grants. The next risk on page 236 is expenditure. This is where we get to something which is actually more public sector focused. It's the flip side of income recognition for corporate entities. So what we're looking at is where, because you're primarily an expenditure driven entity, you could be manipulating that expenditure. And largely that's focused on cut-off, so recognising things in the wrong years. So maybe sort of pushing off into 2021-22 expenditure that should be recognised in this set of accounts. So again, focusing mainly on sort of cut-off areas. 237 is where we get into areas of more significant management judgment, valuation of non-current assets, which basically means property. So we have to look at the various judgments that are used to support those, whether that's yields for sort of commercial properties or whether it's building costs for more sort of civic entities. There is a significant amount of work which has to go into this. It's a very, very high-level focus area for the quality people for audits. So there is a significant amount of work, more than you would probably guess we have to do, but quite a significant area on this because it is so judgmental. Page 238, we're looking at the pension liability or the net pension liability. What we have to look at is a net position of the pension assets and the estimated liability for pensioners, whether they be sort of current pensioners or deferred pensioners or active members as their entitlements accrue. Again, highly judgmental. There is a significant amount of involvement of the actuary employed by the pension fund, and we look at a number of sort of assumptions that feed into that, because very small changes in those assumptions can lead to very significant changes in the values that were being reported. Bank accounts is a more specific tailored issue. We've reported in previous years issues relating to an inability to fully reconcile bank accounts. Clearly that's a fairly key control, lots of sort of cash coming in and out of the council. And whilst there have been some significant improvements in the last couple of years, and the balances that we've quoted here show a notable reduction in that level of unmatched amounts, they do go back quite a few years. And of course, we haven't actually got to a position where they're completely reconciled. So again, focus in that area this year. Related parties, just issues, just keeping that on the agenda really, more not a significant risk, but just an area where we've had issues in the past. I just need to follow up on that. And the final area, which is actually not for the financial statements, relates to our work on use of resources. Later in the plan, there's some information about how things have changed for this year. We aren't looking at a sort of binary yes or no conclusion about whether arrangements are or are not adequate. What we're looking at is a more, I suppose, a more live review, focused more directly on the arrangements themselves rather than just on the risk of getting the conclusion wrong. We do expect the financial position to be a significant risk area which we need to look at. But the more detailed planning on that is still ongoing, and we will come back to this corporate committee with more specific risk focus for that. That was all I really wanted to talk through in terms of the key focus of the plan, but I'm more than happy to take any questions on this as we go through. I do need at some point, probably after questions, to come back to issues related to IT controls reviews where we've identified some issues which we need to pursue. But maybe if I pause now and give a chance for questions.
Thank you very much. Were you going to come back to us on the timeline on page 231? Yeah, okay.
Yes, which is actually linked into the IT issues. But I could cover that now if you wanted me to.
So first of all, are there any questions on the areas that have been covered so far? No? Okay. Yeah, indeed. Oh, Councillor De Mere?
Thanks, Chair. Just a quick point of clarity. I'm not an auditor, but just on the reconciliations, so you said that it's declined. So are these, just so I understand it, reconciliations are perhaps spending and that's occurred somewhere in the council and there's no way to account for that spending? Is that what we're talking about?
Let's think. When we reconcile bank accounts, what we're reconciling in between is sort of the ledger or the cash book, our sort of accounting records, and what the bank statement says. So if you think of your own sort of personal situation, so if you know you've made a payment and you haven't seen it on your bank account, that's a reconciling difference between the two things. So it's just reconciling between what you know you've spent or how you've accounted for it, and what's actually in the bank account. So sometimes it can be things like we've sent checks out to people and they haven't cashed them. Sometimes it could be money that's been banked but hasn't actually made it through to the bank statement yet.
Are there any further questions on the points that have been covered so far? No. Do you want to continue then, David?
Sure. I was going to take you back to page 248 of the pack. There is sort of a caveat paragraph at the bottom of the various references to IT general controls, which we have to look at, and there is an ever-increasing focus on this area. And we have to use specialists now to look at these IT general controls. Things are more complicated than my Luddite abilities will cover. So we have specialist computer auditors who come in to look at things, and that's looking at things like sort of password controls, access, who has access, what they have access to, and those sort of factors. And what we have identified as part of our work this year already, and we've been focusing at this point up to on sort of design and implementation of controls. So not necessarily testing the compliance side of things, but just sort of how they are designed. We've identified a couple of areas of concern relating to the SAP system and also to iWorld, where we consider that arrangements could potentially be manipulated, and situations where we don't think that there are mitigating controls to prevent that. We've had an initial discussion with the finance team about those sort of issues and what we think we need to do about that. So they're still being formulated, but we've given an indication about what we think we need to do. In short, certainly for iWorld, we think there's a lot more substantive testing we have to do. We can't rely on some of the controls for the information, and we are required to basically, if you provide us with a report, we are required to make certain that report is sensible and something we can rely upon as a part of our testing, and we don't think some of those controls work. So it is going to require a fair amount of additional substantive testing, which we are quantifying. There are some other areas which we need to look at in terms of the pension fund as well, but that's a sort of a separate issue. So we think there's extra work to do. We think it's a non-trivial amount of piece of extra work. Coming back to the timeline, what I'm saying here is that we do not think that we can deliver to the timeline that's set out in this plan at the moment, but I don't have an exact extension for how much additional time we think we should need to do that. I think the next corporate committee is the 1st of February, then one after that is the 10th of March. I'm very much hoping that we can still deliver to maybe the one after, so the 10th of March one, but I do not think that we will be in a position to sign off by the 1st of February. So this is a sort of an early warning that there is a threat to that. Needless to say, of course, we'll be working very hard to get things done as quickly as we can do, but there's a real risk.
Okay, thanks for that. Yes, 10th of March would be the last meeting of this committee for the current administration, but we appreciate the pressures on. Councillor Dogan, you have a question?
Yeah. Councillor, you first. Okay. Yeah, thanks. So could you talk a bit more about the testing? You talked about the SAP and manipulation of data. Are you trying to pull data from the system and test that? I'll try to understand a bit more about it. If you just talk about what kind of testing that you are applying and what you want to achieve from the testing. So you talked about the testings that you couldn't perform. And so the question is about, are you trying to pull data from the system in order to quantify it and test it and find out? So what is that testing process?
Sorry. For the SAP system, there are a number of things where we think we may have some controls that we can rely upon. We do a completely separate exercise in terms of extracting a full data set from SAP for our journals testing, which we use. We plug into a data analytics program, which is a bespoke BDO Advantage tool. A number of different things we can do with that, but what that allows us to do is to pick out things which look unusual in that particular way. So we will already, and we will continue to do that sort of data analytics testing. What we're saying is that some of the reports that are generated from SAP, or actually in terms of where we think that the bigger weaknesses are from iWorld, where there are reports or analysis that are produced for us, what we need to do is more testing to make certain we can actually rely upon those reports that are extracted, rather than just saying it's okay, we understand how the extraction works, we can rely upon that extraction, we know it's okay, we'll just get on with the testing. We actually have to do a bit more work before we get to that point. And of course, we do rely upon a number of different reports that come out of the systems, and therefore each and every one of those would need to be subject to more detailed testing.
Do you want to come back, Councillor Dillon?
Actually, comment. So by 1st of February, you reckon that you will be able to apply those tests and get that data? Is that my understanding?
Yeah, we will be extracting that data and doing that testing during this period, but our audit is intended to be complete, or was intended to be complete and reported back to you by the end of February. If we add some extra work in, it means that we can't do it by that point. So we're pushing it a bit further out to allow for that extra time to do that extra work.
I've got Councillor Barnes and then Councillor Amin. Councillor Barnes.
Thank you, Chair. I just wondered, obviously the deadline was September 2021 and 9% of local authorities made that deadline. But this is going to be 6 months later. So what are the implications for the council of this being delivered so late, and also any knock-on impacts on the next round of audit?
Sure. So if I step back, in terms of the deadline, the end of September deadline, we and all the other firms and PSAA and the NAO said that deadline was completely unrealistic. And I think the 9% of audits that have achieved that proves that point, really. The PSAA are monitoring to the end of November, primarily, as I suppose a more realistic judgment as to when things are late. Needless to say, your audit was last signed off in the end of April this year. So you are, I suppose, to an extent behind in terms of starting. So in aiming for the beginning of February, we were effectively catching up with the previous period. If we achieve the 10th of March, we are still nearly 2 months ahead of the previous year. So there are issues in terms of what officers would like to be doing rather than supporting the audit. There are various other sort of priorities in terms of budget setting and financial planning and so forth, and other sort of day job things that they need to do. The implications therefore are more an inconvenience for officers in terms of having to carry on with that. We are not aware of any penalties that have been issued whatsoever to authorities for being late. I think there's a national recognition that there's a crisis in the public audit sector, and also the completion of council's accounts. So I think the regulators are being reasonable and understanding. There are lots of sort of national level meetings which discuss this particular issue. But I think in short, the short answer to you is there are no direct implications, there are no penalties that you are suffering, but there will be some inconvenience, I'm sure, for officers having to support the audit during other priority periods.
This probably isn't a question for you, but more to the chair and the rest of the committee. So if that's the circumstance, what support's available for officers who will invariably have additional workload for a longer period of time than had been planned? And there might not be an answer to that, but it's probably something we should raise.
Yes, indeed. Just while we're on this issue of timescale, I noticed on page 227 you talk about the implications of remote working, and that this increases the time taken to undertake an audit. And I wonder whether that was still a factor in that, at present, we don't have a lockdown. And obviously, in terms of meetings in person, we take care in terms of social distancing and mask wearing and so on, but there isn't actually a ban on meeting together. So what do you anticipate in terms of the balance between in-person auditing and having to deal with it online?
It's a very good question. I have to say, certainly over the summertime, where we did have sort of lockdowns or greater restrictions on how to work, the impact of a second year's worth of auditing remotely has been actually a lot worse than we had expected. I think I have to say, I certainly had expected us to be in a position where it'd be easier. We've done this before, we know what we're doing, we've got the arrangements in place. But the practical reality is that we have a number of new people who come through the system. We have trainees which we bring through. We have recruited to try and sort of address some of the sort of backlogs and so forth. And what that means is that a year on from our previous set of auditing, actually we have a lot more people who've never worked face-to-face before. And some of the softer communication which we have of people working in a room is lost. You don't have people next to you can look at and ask questions quickly. You don't have the ability to just walk and say to the officer, could you just show me how to do this? So these things are quite hard, and people are getting out of a habit. What we're hoping, though, as we go forward with reduced restrictions, is to actually have more time where we can be on site, so that. But we are discussing with officers how that is actually going to work. It wouldn't necessarily be sort of full time, but at least some time, 1 or 2 days a week, would be a good thing. We are within our own offices encouraging staff to come in, 1 or 2 days a week to sit with each other to try and sort of address some of these factors, because it is hard. It is very hard.
Okay, thanks. Councillor Amin?
Thank you. I was just looking at page 241 and just wanted a bit more information, please. The outturn position for the DSG is now 6.8 million overspend. So I note at the end of that section you say you're going to review the strategies to close the budget gap in the coming years. So I just wondered, and I know it's been a overspend for forever, it seems to me sometimes. But I know it's been an overspend for a long time. So what kind of strategies are you going to be looking at with the council to bridge that gap between the overspend and what's the actual spend?
Okay, our main focus is on looking at the arrangements that the authority has in place to deal with these things. So how you go about budgeting and how you go about the financial strategies. So it's not for the auditors to say this is the right or the wrong strategy, but what we are looking at is a combination of information coming through to the council, sensibleness or sort of reasonableness of assumptions that are being made, I suppose taking hard decisions where they need to be taken, that sort of thing. So links from financial management, financial monitoring, financial planning to risk assessments and so forth. So all these things coming together as part of a set of arrangements, and in terms of informed decision making a sensible decision based upon all, well, not all the right, but what we consider to be the most appropriate set of information. So it's a combination of things. Rather than saying this is right or that's right, it's how do you make those decisions? How do you bring all that information together? And then once you've made those decisions, how do you sort of monitor things to make certain you stay on track?
Yes, go on.
Just a very clever response, but I just does that mean so when you come back in February, you will come back with what the council has said that they're going to do to close that gap? Is that how you will come back to us in February? Because it just seems, I mean, I understand what you're saying. It's not your job to tell the council what to do. The council will prepare its own response to bridging that gap. So, you know, what will we get back in February? Because what I'd like to see is a bridging of that gap, because otherwise it will just get bigger and bigger, and I don't know if it'll ever be closed. And it doesn't look like we have a government who will take this area seriously enough to ensure that local authorities who have this big gap are likely to ever bridge that gap.
Okay, I suppose scenario-wise, if we, as I said, we'll primarily be looking at the arrangements in place and how they work. If we can see, or we think we can see, areas of significant weakness, so for example, risk assessment is very, very weak and not supporting sensible decisions about focus of how resources are deployed, then we would report back to you and say, we think you've got an area of significant weakness in this particular arrangement, and this is our recommendation for improvement. Or whether if it's financial planning, you know, there's various different factors you haven't taken into consideration which we think are significant. We think this is an area of significant weakness. You need to make a improvement. So that's what we'd expect to come back with, rather than necessarily what you might expect a bunch of consultants to come in and say, actually, why don't you think about this? What do you think about that? We're not an options people. We are focusing on the arrangements because that's what our code tells us to do.
Were there other aspects of your report that you wanted to highlight to us?
Okay.
In that case, can I just ask a question on page 249, where you state that you've identified a significant control deficiency, and it goes on to talk about reviewing all leases within the council, and that this is a major exercise. So how long is the council estimating this is going to take, and is that going to impact on completion of your audit?
So could you, which page was it?
Page 249, feedback from planning discussions.
Okay. This is the code doesn't bring in Ifrs 16 leasing this year. It's something which is being brought in from the 1st of April 2022. So what we're looking at here is preparation for accounting for leases in a different way. And in short, what Ifrs 16 does is, rather than differentiating between leases as either operating, which is basically just rentals, and you don't account for the asset, or finance leases where you do account for the asset because you're considered to own it. That's all done away with. Ifrs 16 says that pretty much for everything you account for an asset. So what we're looking at is the arrangements that the council's got in place for those leases which are primarily rentals, to see how that would actually convert into proper accounting for assets. So I think what we're saying is that the council wasn't as prepared as we thought it should be, and that there were things which need to be done. There have been a number of deferrals of implementation during the COVID period because basically it's quite a lot of work and people have got other things to do and prioritise. But it's coming back now. So what we're saying is we'll be looking at what your preparation is. Where it does affect the 2021 accounts is there should be some sort of quantification for the impact of this new standard coming in as part of the notes, the accounts, not part of the actual main figures, but part of the notes. So we're looking at that sort of preparation.
Can I just ask one further question, which was about fees? So on page 227, that sets out the fees for the previous audit and for this one, with obviously many of the points to be confirmed at a later stage. For 2019-20, the basic fee is the same as it's going to be for the accounts you're now auditing, and then the additional audit fee, I mean, it states it's been agreed, but I wasn't clear how it's determined, and it seems, how can I put it, surprising that it then ends up at a neat round 300,000. So how was that additional fee determined to give that result?
I have to say this is an inherited position, so I'll say what my understanding is. Two things really. One, the scale fees are based upon a position dating back to 2010. There is a loss of clarity about exactly how the scale fees were set, but my understanding from having worked in the area for 30 years now is that there are a number of different assumptions about how councils operated and how subsidised smaller audits were. But basically, the short story is that nothing has changed fundamentally in terms of the level of fees since 2010. However, the world of auditing has changed beyond all recognition, and the level of work which we have to do, and I mentioned sort of about valuations earlier on, is quantum levels different. So basically much more. And the Redmond report said that they thought fees were understated by at least 25%, and that's 25% average. And what they really mean by that is that it's a lot more in bigger councils, like Haringey, because things are a lot more complicated. So the factors that we have that build into the additional audit fee are the various different sort of risks and so forth that were reported to you over the last few years. I know the completion report from last year was long and complex, and lots of issues sort of raised and adjustments having to be made. Lots of additional work on groups, a lot of additional works on pensions, asset valuations, and so forth. So basically, the additional fee represents that additional work over and above what the scale fee actually does cover. In terms of a round number, I think that's just negotiation. My understanding from costs incurred is that we incurred significantly more than that. So that's a compromise agreed between Lee and the finance team and John. In terms of this year, we don't know. The honest answer is we don't know yet, and I think some of the factors we've been talking about earlier about controls work will actually change that as well. The other issue is, and we mentioned specifically here, use of resources. The new use of resources approach is a much more resource-intensive one. The report which you will get at the end, rather than being sort of a simple yes or no conclusion, is actually sort of quite a long document. It's supposed to replace the annual audit letter, but it's a completely different animal. Much more detail going into that. So this is we don't know yet, but we will keep you informed as we go through. And I promise to be as transparent as we can be with this committee so you understand what we're doing and why we're doing it.
Thanks very much. There are no further questions then. The recommendations on page 217, we're asked to note the contents of the report together with the update we've been given this evening. Is that agreed? Agreed. Thanks very much, Mr. Eagles, for joining us. Okay. Yes.
Feels like the temperature's dropping quite a bit. Could I propose we at least discuss whether we need all these windows open? Well, not discuss, but...
Are the colleagues feeling cold? I mean, we are supposed to have some ventilation to keep us safe. You're a long way from the window, are you? No. Are people generally okay? Yeah. We'll try and generate some hot air and then. So, can we move on to item 9, which is the Audit and Risk Service update for Q2. That starts on page 267. So, Minesh, are you going to introduce this?
Thank you, Chair. So this is the usual report you get from me quarter on quarter. And in this particular instance, I'm reporting on Q2 work from the audit and the fraud team. And I'll just walk you quickly through the key parts of the report. Turning to internal audit first, there's been a lot of work done to plan the audits for the remaining part of the year. At the last meeting I attended, I expressed the view that some of the audits had been delayed from the original start because last year's audits were overrunning, but we are now catching up with some of those. So that's the first part. The second part is I've also made some changes to the audit plan, and I've set those out on pages 269 to 70. And essentially they reflect various changes in the organisation which impact upon either the timing or the original risk profile. Most of those are either audits that have been put back into next year because of other things that have happened this year, or audits that have been added to this year's plan because some other risks have come to light which warrant a more urgent review of those areas. Turning to the anti-fraud work, the fraud team is carrying out essentially a lot of desktop exercise, but they're moving now to a more going out and doing their work type of exercise, which is what they did pre-COVID. That has hampered their ability to be able to be the eyes and ears on the ground, particularly around tenancy fraud. But I'm pleased to report that the team has started to pick up the pace. And though we don't actually have a specific target as such, I'm keen to make sure that I can demonstrate to this committee the value of the fraud work that we do. And that's essentially captured in two key performance indicators. One relating to the recovery of properties which are being used illegally by people who shouldn't be there. And the other is where people try to exercise their right to buy when actually either the funds they have are not bona fide or that they're not entitled to buy the property in the first instance. We do a lot of work in that area, and you'll see that on page 272 there's a little table that sets out the current performance. I'm also pleased to say that there is actually, we noticed during COVID that the number of referrals we were getting through our fraud hotline had declined slightly, but I'm pleased to say that that actually is picking up again as the activity is picking up. There is some other information on the various types of fraud works that we do, but I'll take that as read and answer any specific questions members may have.
Thanks very much. Are there any questions? Councillor Edgeworth.
Thank you, Chair. I hope you will bear with me. I have actually got a number of questions on this particular report. So if I ask them in batches of 2, and then if you can just get a quick response, that'd be great. Yeah. On page 270, early help care plans have been removed from our audit plan, and commercial and land property has been added. Can I ask why early help care plans were removed and whether or not there's the capacity to continue doing them? It says it will be reviewed as part of 2023, but I don't think we're far enough in front of that yet to say that everything's okay. So can you tell me why that's been removed? And commercial land property, there was a management request to add that in. Has there been particular problems there?
Thank you, Chair. Yes. So for early years, that audit has essentially been put back from the original plan. We were planning to do the audit in Q3, and we've delayed it by 6 months, only to accommodate the findings from the CQC visit and to make sure that any learning and changes in systems is allowed to embed before we come to do the audit. But I take your point, Councillor Ejiofor. I think it's one area that we do need to keep an eye on because it's such a large area of spend. And previously, Councillor Brabazon has also raised some points around making sure that we have a strong audit presence around early years. So I will keep an eye on the area. For the time being, though, I think it's wise just to give the team an opportunity, the service, to make the changes they wish before I go and do an audit. But if time affords, I will have the resources to do the audit in Q4, potentially.
Were you going to move on to the commercial land and property? Yeah.
Okay, so quite right. There have been concerns raised with me around commercial land and property. Essentially, this is making sure that we have a robust arrangement for the management of our commercial portfolio. I think it's fair to say that the director has some concerns around how effective that management is. So he's asked me to consider putting that audit, which I have, to the plan.
So will we get a report back somewhere to this committee at some time, and that will be in our list of expectations? I've got Parkview School, which talks about cyber fraud. My question on this, is there any evidence of similar problems elsewhere, or is this a particular one-off?
Thank you. So this is the only one that's been brought to my attention from a school's perspective, or in fact, actually a school or council perspective. But I think it's really important to bear in mind that cyber fraud is proliferating at an exponential rate, not just for local authorities, but just across every facet of all our operations and private and in our workplace. So it's one area that is very high up on our risk profile, and we continue to do a lot of work in that area. In fact, we've got an audit on cyber fraud for this year's plan as well, and I'll be bringing a paper of the findings of that audit to this meeting as well.
Final two, Chair. I have a general concern that we have lots of numbers without context. We don't know whether we are doing better than we were before, and I'd like to see, with all of the things, all of the different headings between 14.3 and 14.13, I'd like us to be able to get some sort of report on where we've gone over the past 2 years, because we've got lots of numbers. We don't know if it's good, we don't know if it's bad, we don't know on where we are with some of the outcomes of some of these reports. It's not clear about what learning has come from those reports. Is that possible?
Councillor Jafar, what I do is, at the end of each financial year, I produce an annual report, and the annual report sets out in full the work relating to the anti-fraud as well as the audit work, and, as you say, the learnings that come from that, and the sorts of numbers relating to each of those different strands. So yes, that's published in the annual report.
Okay, the point I'm making is you've got numbers in this report, they're meaningless, right? You know, there's no point in putting these numbers in here if they can't put them in context, right? So you say that we do it once a year, okay, fine, but you need to put the numbers in this report into some form of context. I take, for example, 14.6, tenancy fraud. We've opened 190 cases, so we have 190 open cases, 53 referrals, 243 total cases open. We've recovered 7 properties, we've closed 3 cases, so that's 13 cases have come to a conclusion that leaves 230 cases outstanding. Now, you know, is that 230 cases over the course of a year or 230 cases over the course of a month? Right? It's a meaningless figure that doesn't give us any understanding on where we are getting properties back that we can see as have been subject to fraud. So on that particular question, I don't know whether we should be happy that we've got 7 properties back from 243 cases. What do you think?
So I think there's 2 or 3 parts there. In terms of the number, that 230 represents ongoing investigations as of the end of September. So that's the significance of that number. But
so I have to jump in on that. So do you open 1 case a day, Because 230, how long does it take to investigate a case? So you've got 230 there, right? And this is part of the conversation about context.
Yeah. So just coming to the next bit of that, the 230 represents the number of cases at the end of September, but I'm happy to bring, if you like, a comparison of how that compares with the previous quarter. We can report quarter by quarter or on a cyclical basis. That's absolutely fine. In terms of what that represents, it's about the same sort of level of cases that we had at the end of quarter one. It's not particularly different.
So just as a final, so I didn't quite get an answer to that. Are you telling me that 230 is how many cases we have every quarter? Then what does that 230 represent, and how long does each case take to deal with?
So the 230 represents the number of ongoing investigations as at the end of September. The number of, so if I can just say one more thing, the number of referrals we received in the quarter was 53. So we received 53 new referrals in quarter two. That took the total number of referrals plus the ongoing cases to 243. Of those, 13 were concluded, leaving the 230.
I'm sorry, Chair, I really didn't want to continue this, but I haven't got a response to the question that I was asking. If 53 cases are the number of cases we've opened in a quarter, are you telling me that some of these other 190 cases have had a birthday because they're more than a year old? That's the question that I'm asking.
There are some cases in amongst the numbers that we have which are slightly older profiled, and we can't finish those investigations until we carry out some further checks. And those checks would be actual physical visits to those properties. And that has been delayed because of COVID. But what I'm saying is that we're getting through those now because people have started the investigators have started to go out, and we're bringing those numbers down. Does that?
I think it would be helpful then, when you come back to us with more information, to give us an idea of sort of the average length of time for resolving cases, and appreciate that some may take a long time and others may be resolved fairly quickly. I think that would be helpful. Did you have any further questions? I believe Councillor Rossetti wants to ask a question.
Yes, Chair, thank you.
Okay.
Thank
Go
you.
ahead.
Good evening, everyone. I would like to ask as well something about Table 1. And I've seen that the audit on the purchasing cycle and management of contract registers have been removed on request of Director of Environment and Neighborhoods. And if I understand the rationale is because there's going to be a corporate review of the operating model carried out by the service. Now, I would like to understand why these two items have been removed, even in light of the previous question from this committee about procurement waivers, and also understand what kind of reassurances we have received that the service will be able to carry out an audit or a review, and if they had the necessary skill to do such an effort. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Could you come back on that, Minesh?
Thank you. That's a really good point. So I've previously reported to this committee my concerns around the effectiveness of contract management. And I've carried out over the last 2 or 3 years a number of contract management audits, and essentially most of those have been given a low level of assurance. I think from memory, there's been 4 separate reviews. 3 have been given limited assurances, and 1 has been given a satisfactory level of assurance. So you're absolutely right to highlight the fact that there is a weakness in how effective we are in managing contracts. The only reason this audit has been put back is because what's happening corporately is that there is a organizational-wide review of how we are going to carry out procurement-related activities, including contract management. So essentially, instead of, so the plan, I suppose, is that I want to see what it is that management put in place as a new contract management regime and audit that regime and bring my findings to you from that, rather than reporting on what I know is already an area of weakness.
Okay, but I'm
Do you want to come back?
Yes, if I may, because the table says that the request is not coming from the audit service, it's coming directly from the service that would be the subject and yes, of the audit itself. And that they're going to do the review rather than the audit service.
Yeah, sorry, if I can clarify, the audit sponsor, i.e. the person who is going to be audited, is the Director for Environment and Neighbourhood, but he's not the one who's requesting that I don't do the audit. The decision to delay the start of that audit is by the audit service. Sorry, just to clarify that point.
Okay.
Thank you, yes.
Councillor Demir, do you want to come in on this point?
I didn't hear that last bit, just the decision to remove it. I didn't hear that last bit. So.
Every year I carry out an audit of contract management. We know that there are weaknesses in how effective we are in doing contract management. As a result of the audit work done so far, the organisation is carrying out a root and branch review of how it carries out contract management in future, and it intends to change its process. So the idea is we are going to, from an audit point of view, we are going to wait for that new arrangement to be put in place and then do a contract management audit of the new arrangement rather than spend time doing contract management of things that we know are not working. Essentially, that's the position.
So can I just ask, while we're on this point, on page 276, where there's the Mazars report of what they have been doing, they are doing fieldwork stage for contract management, it says. So how does that fit with deferring the actual issue of the contract register?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, that contract management is a follow-up. So, you know, I've said to you previously that when I do my work, after 6 months, we do a follow-up to see if the recommendations have been implemented. That is a follow-up to the previous audit's work.
Thanks. Councillor Amin, you had a question?
I don't know whether it's appropriate for you or not. So I just wondered whether there's any staff issues around that as well, whether there are deficiencies in the way tenancies are managed or handed out or whatever, whether there's some staff issues in there, because it doesn't feel, it feels like we're doing it after the event rather than before the event. And I also thinking about it, they've got a new structure coming into place in October 2021. So that new process will be embedded. I wondered whether the council should recuperate some of the cost of the audit itself as well, because it feels as if we're doing Homes for Haringey's audit, which is right and proper, but it feels as if there's a cost attached to it, which should be recuperated back by the council.
Thank you, Councillor Amin. The first point is whether there are weaknesses in how we let tenancies. I don't think we've got any more or any less resilience in how we manage tenancies. I think that's a pretty standard procedure across most local authorities. But what happens with a lot of these cases is that people find ways sometimes of contriving an arrangement which leads to a decision being made that we will have them as our tenant. So that risk is always there. So that's the first part. And secondly, in terms of the arrangement with Homes for Haringey, we have an officer who works for Homes for Haringey, but they spend 3 days with us. Sorry, no, 2 days with us and 3 days with Homes for Haringey, and they act as the conduit between the fraud investigation team and Homes for Haringey. So we do get the benefit of trying to utilise their resource to service some of the things that we do. I think the interesting point, I suppose, is should we be charging Homes for Haringey more for the work that we do? It's worth thinking about. It's worth thinking about.
Are there any further questions? Councillor Demir.
Thanks, Minesh. I just wanted to ask about the 11 no recourse to public funds that you've been asked to respond to, and you've responded. There's no outcome on those that I could find in the report. Can you just give us a bit of a breakdown?
Thank you, Councillor Demir. If you wouldn't mind, let me send you and all the members an update on those 11 cases, if I may, please. Just by a very short background, we get requests from the service to carry out a review of those cases where there is a suggestion of some sort of irregularity, information not being shared in full. So where the service becomes concerned that actually the information they've been given isn't the full story, they will ask the fraud team to do a bit of work to see if they can get to the bottom of what that may be. And typically it's things like we don't have the full financial information, or there may be other people in the family that we are not aware of that the service believes may exist, or there may be some earnings. But if I can give you a breakdown of how the 11 is made up.
And just a quick follow-up as well on something else. Just around, again, just so I understand, around audits that are added and removed. So when I suppose a director will come to you and say, oh, can we remove this because we're actually going to do a corporate review? Is there a timeline of when that corporate review has to be finished? So essentially, they're not holding back on doing something that we need to do, but also at the same time stopping you from what you need to do. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Demir. So what happens there is that at the start of each financial year, I come to this committee with an audit plan, and I set out the areas I'd like to review and why. And all of that is essentially driven by key areas of risk. So it's a risk-based audit plan, and that is the professional dictate in terms of how audits should be carried out. Where people suggest changes, either additions, deletions, amendments, essentially I go back to that point around what the key risks were, reassess based on the information that is now available, because thus at the start of the year things can change as we move along the year. And if, in my view, what the risk profile suggests is either increased or decreased in some way, then I will change the plan accordingly. So in the examples that we have for this cycle, I've put a couple of audits back simply because of some changes which are being carried out now. That is not to say the audits won't be done, it's just to say that I'm not doing them now, but they will be done at some point. And if the directors come to me and say, Minesh, there is an area of risk that I wish you to examine, I'll look at that as well.
Thank you very much. Are there any further questions? In that case, recommendations on page 267. We're asked to note the activities of the team in Q2. Is that agreed? Thank you. So we move on to item 10, which is the Treasury Management Update. Sorry, Councillor Berriman.
Just for information, I downloaded a thermometer app. I don't know how accurate it is, but it says it's 9 degrees in here. I think that doesn't feel that cold.
well, it really doesn't feel 9 degrees to me, I must say.
It doesn't feel that cold, but it's 14 is the legal.
I think the consensus was that people are okay and want some ventilation, so I think we need to move on.
I might be leaving early because it is getting chilly.
Okay, well, I hope not. Item 10, Treasury Management Update. Tim Mapofo is joining us. Do you want to introduce the item?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Tim Mpofu, and I'm the head of pensions and treasury here at Haringey. The report I'll be presenting to you or introducing is the Treasury Update Media Report. So this report essentially just provides an update of the treasury management activities for the first half of this financial year. So members will be familiar with this report. We do present one to you every quarter. So a lot of the content that's in the report has just been updated to reflect the full the half-year impact of the activities. The report is for members to note, so no decision will be required from you from the report this evening. But I would like to highlight that this report will go on to full council and will require to be approved as is required by the Prudential Code. There is one key area that I would like to sort of bring to members' attention, and that is in section 4 of the appendix to this report, which is essentially the borrowing strategy update. So it's just to highlight to members that so far this year, we have taken on additional borrowing of about 41 million, 11 of which has been long-term and 30 of which has been sort of short-term in nature. And that's really part of the council strategy to try and strike a balance between having low interest costs, but also ensuring that we're securing long-term costs for the future. We do anticipate that for the remainder of the year, we will take more long-term borrowing, and this is in line with the Treasury management strategy that was approved earlier this year. So like I mentioned before, the rest of the report is really sort of tables and information that you would be familiar with. And I can only confirm that the activity that has been carried out so far this year has been in line with the Treasury strategy update, and we always have a section 6 of the report sort of contains the prudential indicators that we set at the beginning of the year and measure ourselves during the course of the year, and we're compliant across all those indicators. So there aren't any other areas in that report that I would like to sort of highlight for attention, but if there are obviously any questions from members, I'll be happy to take those at this time.
Thanks very much. Are there any questions on that report? Councillor Ejiofor.
Thank you, Chair. There's been some conversation about when we repay borrowing, and we've got some LOBO loans, which we've had for a number of years. What's our process for repaying these, and how are we doing it now, the time that, you know, if you look around us, money is at a historically low level in terms of interest rates? Are we taking advantage of that?
So, yeah, that's a good question. So just to sort of maybe explain a bit about how the LOBOs are, what the LOBOs are. So the LOBO loans, essentially, they give the lender an option to be able to sort of exercise their right to raise interest at any, they're sort of like maybe, I think they're some of them are 6 months, some of them are every 3 years or so. They have this option on that date where they can exercise to increase the rates. If they decide to do so, as a council, we can decide to either accept the new rate, or we can decide to repay the full loan in full. If that was the case, then we'd be able to repay the full loan without having to raise any additional costs. So the problem at the moment is rates are at historic lows. Some of these levels are a bit higher, and the chances of a lender sort of doing that policy or deciding to come to us and exercise that option remain very low. So at the moment, we haven't had any of our lenders sort of come to us and present us with that option. But if they were to do so, then that's something we would be exercised. And the council does have a policy that's clear on that. In terms of sort of trying to take advantage of it, this is something that we look at quite closely with our Treasury advisor. So we've had several conversations trying to sort of establish if there are any opportunities for us to take advantage of any opportunities to repay the LOBOs. At the moment, those opportunities haven't materialized. So the policy that we currently have in place is if we are able to agree a deal with one of the local lenders where we are able to actually make a material net saving for the council, then that's something we'd be looking to exercise. So yeah, this is something that we're periodically checking with our Treasury advisor, and if there was to be an opportunity, we'll be able to bring an update to this committee to explain the steps that are taken to reach that conclusion.
Thank you. Do you want to come back on that?
Just to follow up, which is generally the way that we refinance our ongoing borrowing, because obviously, as I said, it comes back down to the potential price of money now and the likelihood that the next movement in interest rates is going to be up. So we've got financial advisors who are on this. Are they really proposing that we don't do anything?
So with regards to the logos, trying to exit those would be quite expensive. So I'm just getting a bit of feedback on my mic. Yeah, so in terms of the logos, it will be quite expensive to be able to sort of repay those, because you have to pay high premiums to exit them. A lot of them are very long dated. But in terms of the remaining strategy, we are looking, this is why I sort of suggested at the beginning that it is likely that we'll take more loans. We are conscious of the fact that rates are likely to go up next year. So we're trying to lock in some of those sort of the short-term borrowing, the longer-term rates. We're trying to lock in some of those, particularly for the HRA and also for the general fund. So the approach has been, I think, in historical years that we've looked at where the rates were. There wasn't sort of a need for us to have cash at the moment because the rates are not sort of high enough. So what we're using was our internal borrowing resources. But at this time now, we're looking to sort of lock in those rates because we think the trend going forward will be, there's more likelihood that the rates will go up. So it's something that we consistently sort of have conversations with our advisors. And what they advise us is a range where they feel like it's a good opportunity for us to borrow. And then they also set us some trigger rates where they feel like we'll be able to take advantage of those. And certainly with the loans that we've taken, we took them when they were quite low in the summer, and that was based on the advice that we received from our Treasury advisors.
Thanks very much. Okay. Any further questions? No. Well, thanks for that report. So, members, we're asked to the recommendations on page 279. We're asked to note the Treasury management activity during the first half of the year and to note that that was undertaken in line with the approved Treasury management strategy. Is that agreed? Thank you. Thanks very much, Tim, for that. So we move on to agenda item 11, which is building, place and street name review. I think Charlotte Pomeroy is going to introduce this item. Over to you, Charlotte.
Thank you, Chair, and good evening, members of the committee. So this paper responds to the Corporate Committee request for further consultation on the renaming of Black Boy Lane and sets out the Council's proposed approach, working closely with residents and communities really to improve the diversity and representation we have in the borough. So we recognise this is an area where we want to have a sort of reflective and fully engaged set of conversations with our local residents. So just turning to the background set out in the report, members will be aware that the murder of George Floyd and the disproportionate impact of COVID on our Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities led to a sort of reconsideration of our approach to discrimination and racism. Equally, the Mayor of London set out a commission on diversity in the public realm, and we in the council set out a local review for place naming. Some of the early projects that were brought forward included the Oliver Reginald Tambo Recreation Ground and consideration of renaming Black Boy Lane. However, rather than focusing on individual sites and recognising that ask for greater consultation and also the disparity between the consultation outcomes from residents directly affected by the proposed renaming and a wider set of community residents. We looked at our approach, considered a wider conversation, which was very much community-led, part of an ongoing conversation to really think about how residents identify with their local areas, their shared histories, the reflections that they have, and to build a sort of process of engagement to determine where the priorities lay for local residents. We set out in the paper a proposal to develop a strategic framework to co-produce that with our local residents, to do that in a very collaborative way. We want to build a sort of shared understanding of the areas that are important to local residents through engagement, and have a really strong approach to celebrating our existing diversity and better understanding for all residents of how that plays through, really increasing our involvement in this process through co-production and collaboration, which we hope will also address some of the systemic inequalities that we see in the borough and that have been exacerbated through the pandemic. So this report is before you for noting tonight, and sets out that wider approach to understanding how we might rethink our public realm in light of the fantastic diversity we have in the borough. So I'm happy to take any questions, and I hope that introduces the paper. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Councillor Amin?
A quick question, actually, Charlotte.
We haven't got any sound here, sorry, online.
Member, can you hear it now?
Just got you now, yes, thank you. I just heard you say
Sorry,
no.
which cabinet member does the report sit under, please? Who leads on this? Which cabinet member leads on this area, please?
So this is a report from the leader, Councillor Ahmed.
Okay, thank you.
Right. Councillor Ejiofor?
Yeah, thank you for bringing me in on this, Chair. I hope you'll indulge me to speak for a couple of minutes, because I have to say that I'm very, very disappointed with the content of this report, particularly from where this particular committee was on the 17th of March. This committee had a very long discussion on the report that came to them on renaming Black Boy Lane. Had a very long discussion, made a number of suggestions, a number of recommendations, a number of things that were supposed to have happened between March and October, let alone November, and a number of these things haven't actually occurred yet. But the officers also talked about a number of the concerns that were raised during the consultation, concerns raised by opponents of change, concerns raised by residents, concerns raised by anti-racists who, the name Black Boy Lane itself, you know, it's offensive. I'm sorry, a lot of African heritage people are offended by the street name itself. A number of other anti-racists are equally offended, and the report seems to subsume the proposal to rename Black Boy Lane in some pretty deep grass, to be quite frank. And I'd like us, for this particular committee, to get to a position where we can separate the broader street naming and buildings review from an actual decision on the renaming of Black Boy Lane. If I can go back to some of the things that this committee members said and raised before, they talked about the fact that the letters that were sent to residents and the diversity of the information that was available. Letters were available in 12 different languages, for example. They talked about that officers made clear that most of the costs incurred from the name change itself were notional costs and would be met from existing budgets. And officers also advised that they were satisfied that the package of a whole, which is the support package for residents, were the council to change the name of Black Boy Lane, were sufficient to meet the needs of those affected residents. It also clarified that the council would always look to support its residents wherever it could. and that where there were potential impacts, the council would look to see how the impacts could be alleviated. Officers also highlighted that council had to give due consideration to the equalities impacts, including the need to foster community cohesion. And what could be more cohesive than changing something that a number of members of the community find offensive? And there's the broader conversation around the buildings and street naming review. You can have a conversation about names like Kitchener or Buller, or even Rhodes, about whether or not it was this yeah, or whether it was this one or that one. But you can't really have that same conversation around the phrase black boy. You know, you're not having an argument about whether or not X, Y, Z is it's offensive, because a number of people will tell you straight off that it's something that needs to be changed. Officers were asked to do 3 consultations on this this proposal, and the 3rd consultation post-lockdown. Nowhere in this report does it show that any action has happened whatsoever out in the community, and lockdown's been gone for over 3 months now. And officers were also happy to with the quality and the legal status of the consultation. There were questions raised about whether the consultation was appropriate, and it's been clear from the officers' response to the report that they were comfortable with their. And I also advised that in the example which was mentioned about renaming Town Hall Approach, this was not directly comparable with the renaming of Black Boy Lane, because quite frankly, you know, most people don't find Town Hall Approach offensive. Fighting anti-racism can sometimes be perceived as a lower priority. I know as an African heritage man, that's how often I feel when people think, well, do you know what, it doesn't really matter. I know that, that the Indian cricketers, in their experience with Yorkshire Cricket Club, also found that people thought, well, do you know, it's something that we'll deal with later. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't really offend all that many people. The answer is, do you know what? Yes, it does. And this is exactly the sort of decisions that councils should lead on. Councils should be the harbingers of change. They should be there to bring communities together. And the existing guidance on street naming, it's something that we can deal with for the broader review, but I don't think this should be something where we find a way to kick the decision on Black Boy Lane into the ground. Looking back on some of the comments made by members of this committee, a number of members said that they acknowledged that the need to change the street lane, and they commented that they agreed that people found the current name offensive. This is what this committee decided and what this committee thought back in the days. All right. I think, and I promise you, I could go on, but I can feel that some of my colleagues are twitching and eager to come in as well. The committee was assured that officers felt that the risks of a judicial review were very low, and that the guidance that they've been provided with fully considered that the council had met all of the relevant legal requirements to take the decisions that it took. Changing the name is an appropriate thing to do. It's something, again, that the committee agreed, and I know that when we have a conversation on this, that I feel that this committee will similarly agree that it's something that we should be looking to do. If we delay taking a decision on Black Boy Lane, it will just get pushed into the deep grass. Now, and that was one of the things that committee members also pointed out at the meeting on March the 22nd, that when it was proposed that there was a delay, it was said that, you know, just a delay would just vacillate, and it will mean that we never get to a situation where this particular decision is taken. It's clear that over the last 6 months, nothing's happened. Nothing has happened at all. We're no closer to making a decision on this than we were before. 1 minute, please, Chair. All right. Challenging racism should be everybody's business. And as a progressive council, there are times that we need to lead change rather than being held back by doubt. And I note that the recommendation on this report is merely to note the report and to move on. I feel that that there's the opportunity here for this committee to take a slightly different view and to note the process moving forward with the broader review, but to take a different outcome and to make a different decision on where we are with the renaming of Black Boy Lane. And so, Chair, I'd like to give you formal notice that I'd like to move an amendment to the recommendations, and I'm happy to provide this amendment in writing, but let me just read the amendments for colleagues present. This corporate committee has decided that we should separate the process for a broader buildings review from the process for moving forward the renaming of Black Boy Lane. This committee recalls the comments made by the corporate committee at their meeting of the 17th of March and notes that the committee has already agreed the following. They've considered the feedback from the second statutory consultation, which is notice of intention, on the renaming of Black Boy Lane to La Rose Lane. In particular, they've noted the objections from residents and the organisations directly affected by the proposed renaming. This committee considered and took into account the Equalities Impact Assessment of the proposed change on protected group and the actions proposed to mitigate the impact, including a commitment to provide support, dedicated staff resource and resident organisation payments. And furthermore, using the authority granted to this committee under the London Buildings Act (open brackets amendment close brackets 1939) section 6 open brackets paragraph 1 close brackets now agrees to the making of an order to rename Black Boy Lane to La Rose Lane to take effect on the 1st of February 2022 and concurs that officers should now provide the necessary assurances to residents of Black Boy Lane for the change of this street name. The committee also instructs officers that the support package offered to the residents be further explained and clarified. I'd like to move that as a formal amendment to the recommendations of this report.
That is an incredibly long amendment. I don't know how you expect us to take that into account when we don't have anything in writing. Don't speak over me. I didn't interrupt you.
Sorry, Chair.
But it is a very long amendment, and I wonder how the committee can possibly be expected to get their heads around what you are proposing. You said about bringing communities together. That's what this report is about. While the recommendation is to note it, the clear implication, of course, is that we would get further updates on the partnership work that is proposed here. It's about trying to bring people together and recognising that the consultation that did take place, of the residents of Black Boy Lane who responded, they voted 3-1 against changing the name. So there's work to be done, and that's what this report is seeking to do, and to have that wider conversation, not just with residents of the road, but across the borough, and to get them on board on what we can do to tackle racism and discrimination in the borough. So I just make that point in terms of what we are asking members to do with this report. But we have Councillor Ibrahim wanted to come in.
I would just like to add to Councillor Ejiofor's disappointment that we're not being asked to concertedly move forward with this. Obviously, the chair has expressed his view that this is about bringing people together, and we do want to bring people together. It's extremely important that we do, but the residents of Black Boy Lane are not the only people that are affected by this offensive road name. If you are a daily user of the 67 bus and you do not live in this borough and you do not know why it's called Black Boy Lane, then when you are going past that stop, to hear every day or any day that road name is offensive, and ultimately we need to concertedly move forward with this. We can kick it into the long grass, we can decide not to do it, but we ultimately need to make sure that this is a decision that we make, that we don't procrastinate on it, because for me, as a Knoll Park councillor, I'd quite like to see the name change of Redvers Road and Buller Road because of those historic links. If we can't agree to change a name as offensive as Black Boy Lane, then how am I to expect that I'm ever going to be in a situation where we can change the name of Redvers Road and Buller Road? And actually, the names of those roads do not just affect the residents of those roads, because actually they're not residential roads particularly, it's where the bus garage is, but they actually affect the people that come to our borough, and it's a reputational issue for us. When I came to this borough as a young child, I was actually shocked by the time I was a teenager, because I lived in Wood Green, that there was a road called Black Boy Lane. I was actually quite shocked by that, and I think we need to move with this, and we need to move with it as soon as we possibly can and set a time frame in order to do that.
Councillor Tabwa.
Thank you, Chair. May I just say that I have to drive on that road 6 times a day, and 6 times a day bothers me. I've had multiple discussions with drivers in my garage who are bothered by it. And because they know I'm a councillor in this area and things like that, they actually come and ask me, is there anything you can do about that? And I'm sitting here with this report that, as far as I'm concerned, does the usual thing when it's matters that concern black racism in particular, where it thinks that you can just do fluffy things and it will just die in the wind. I believe that we have an opportunity today to make a decision and to actually show what Haringey is about. And if it means that, yes, hard leadership upsets people sometimes, for this and for things like this, it is definitely worth it. And for me, as a black man who has been raised in this area and lived all around, I'm really disappointed that once again, what we are getting is a whitewash. Racism is a serious matter. I'm sure you would agree. So I'm asking you to deal with it in that way and not just, as mentioned before, try and throw it in the long grass and defer the decision and defer it on until there's a new committee who will even forget about it. We are fed up of that.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Amin and then Councillor Barnes.
First, I'd like to second that motion from Councillor Ejiofor. There's a couple of points. One is, I think I looked at the minutes of the meeting that was held in March 17th, and Office has also directed the committee to paragraph 6.3 of the report, which showed that 36% was the turnout of people who voted, and there were 48 objections in total. There are 183 properties on that street, and the officers noted that the remaining households, 64%, had also been included in consultation but had not responded. So the actual response rate was very, very low. And as Councillor Ibrahim mentioned, it isn't just about the people who live on the street. It's about people who have to walk through the street, who live in Haringey in a wider sense. Before I came to the meeting, I had a bit of a chat with people who were involved with the renaming of the pub that was at the top of Black Boy Lane. It was renamed, I think, in the 80s after a massive campaign ran by Baroness Osmo, Stella Dadsey, and a whole lot of black women. Actually, it was a whole lot of black women who led that campaign and got Watney's, the distillers and the brewery, to get that name changed. And the message I got from this group of people was the pain, the trauma, and for this should be changed because of the pain, the trauma, and for the repair of all black people who continue to pay for the naming of the pub and the road. This should be part of reparation, and Haringey should be part of that. Tell residents of, and they should be able to tell residents of the shame of, pain behind, and the reason why it is named in such a way. Not many will want to continue to live with that shame. Please, please, please agree on removing the name and name it whatever you like. This is just one of the ladies who I spoke to. Whatever you like, but please let's remove this name because it's so offensive. And I think from my perspective, you know, I went through that report, Chair, with a tooth comb, and I was disappointed. I was so disappointed at the motion that was raised at that meeting. And you're saying that the motion that Councillor Ejiofor put today was a bit too long, but the intention is quite straightforward. And it was agreed, I think, and I was doubly disappointed because it was voted on by, I reckon, about 1, 2, 3, 4 people who voted in favour of it. Unfortunately, 4 people abstained as well. No, 3 councillors abstained, and 4 people voted against the amendment. From my perspective, I think nothing shames me in than reading what I've just, you know, looked at now. And so I would say to you, Chair, you're a principled man. You're quite straightforward about all these things. So I would expect us to be able to take this forward today, the same as we would if it was another chair. Hopefully, not the chair, previous chair. But anyway, I'm gabbling on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Barnes.
So I don't know if there's some kind of middle ground because Black Boy Lane has been debated a lot, and I wonder if we can accelerate that and have that name changed as quickly as possible while a wider review goes on across the borough of various different buildings and streets or new properties and new roads that we'll have invariably. But this is, I think in March I voted for it just to happen. The consultation had been done. It wasn't necessarily fully successful. I'm not speaking against, but I want to get something to happen quite quickly. And then we can maybe talk about the good examples where this has happened, the recreation ground at OR Tambo near me, for example, and explain what it really means to residents and whether it is such a big problem as some of them seem to think it might be for administrative purposes.
Thank you. Councillor Berriman.
Yeah, Chair, could we clarify with the legal, because we did a statutory consultation that was against this, and I'm not sure if a committee like this has the power to just go ahead and do something on the night. Certainly haven't seen anything in writing, so can we just get a bit of an indication from our legal advice?
Yes, I mean, we'd normally have legal advice on a proposal. Can you assist us there?
Sorry, the extent of the question is in relation to the consultation that was undertaken. Once more then,
there
please,
seems
Councillor
to
Berriman.
be something in the room. I didn't get the gist. I got the gist, but I don't know exactly what the amendment said, that we could rename the road here and now, and that doesn't seem to be possible, unless you could tell me otherwise.
That's why I hesitated, because I'd like to see the amendment as well. But could you put the question? I haven't seen the amendment.
What power does this committee have in relation to a decision such as renaming a road, especially as there's been a statutory consultation that was against it?
The statutory consultation wasn't against.
Can we just talk through the chair, please? So I think the question was about whether the council can proceed given the statutory consultation and the fact that the residents of the road who responded, they were 3-1 against.
Yeah, it's more about whether this committee could propose something like this. It's normally a proposal comes to the committee, not a proposal made on the night.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd certainly like to look into that further, Councillor Berriman, because it's a reasonable point that you do make. And so once we've exhausted questions, it may be helpful if the committee rose 5 minutes so that we can give a proper consideration of it, because it's a reasonable question, I agree.
So I had Councillor Ibrahim was also indicating.
Yeah, no, I was just going to, because obviously I raised my hand when Dawn was speaking, and it was to say, I think what you've suggested is what Councillor Ejiofor has proposed. So it's to have the wider review, but get on with renaming Black Boy Lane. So it sounds like you're in agreement. I just think it's really important also at this point to point out, yes, the views of residents are important, but most people who live on roads don't get to name their roads or don't get to decide the names of their roads. You buy a house or rent a house or allocate a house by the local authority, and the name of the road is the name of the road that you're on. You don't actually, in most cases, get to decide what that name is. I think this goes far and wide beyond that. So I just think it's making sure that we take into account people's views, but we put them in their proper perspective as well.
Councillor Ejiofor.
Thank you, Chair. Just to come back on a couple of things, I think it's important to make clear that the statutory consultation wasn't against this as a proposal, but there was a difference of opinion between people who lived on Black Boy Lane and people who lived in the broader borough. But the fact is, the legal definition of that statutory consultation did not restrict that consultation to people who lived on Black Boy Lane. It's a borough-wide consultation. That's what the legal definition, the statutory situation, the legal situation was of the statutory consultation. It was not about people who just lived on Black Boy Lane. It is within the authority of this committee to take a view and to balance the views of people who lived on the street, people who live in the broader borough, and other statutory consultees. It is within the authority of this committee to take a view. What's been proposed here is an amendment to the existing recommendation here. And I have to say that when in a previous time, when a different recommendation was made to this committee, an amendment was taken and a decision was agreed by a vote of the committee. It is a great concern to me that nothing happened after that previous decision, and here we are with a situation where we're able to separate the broader buildings review, which I think building street name review, from a specific decision to right a specific anomaly and a specific egregious wrong.
Can I just say, in relation to you say nothing happened after the previous decision in March. I mean, there were a number of factors in that. Firstly, COVID restrictions, pre-election period, but also the resource implications of that decision, because it envisaged face-to-face consultations and it asked for the support package to be reviewed, for which there wasn't a budget at the time. I think we have a couple of people indicating online. Do we have Councillor Hakata wants to make a comment?
Yeah, thank you.
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me okay? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. Yeah.
Sorry. Okay. What I want to say is on two points. One of them is about us taking a strategic approach, which is what this report delivers, and I think it's the correct approach. It's about, there are, for instance, Red vs. Buller was brought up in this conversation, and Red vs. Buller was the commander-in-chief of the British forces in South Africa during the times of the Boer Wars and the Zulu Wars, and was responsible for the ruthless massacre of Zulus. So, in many ways, a road that maybe people don't recognise that name, as many people don't recognise Cecil Rhodes's name these days. Actually, to celebrate the names of those people and the actions of those people now is extremely concerning. And I think that instead of taking an ad hoc approach, we need this strategic approach to really understand where these names come from, who we are celebrating, and what monuments we have for their lives. And I think we need that strategic approach, because actually it's not as simple as just picking and choosing which ones we like the best or don't. It actually is about an important historical impact. Secondly, it's about not simply just changing the name. And just for the record, I actually agree that I do believe that it is a name that I think should be changed. But it is also what we're going to change that name to. And the George Padmore Institute, which is a hugely important, vital and respected archive and educational institute for Black culture, politics and history, in fact, Linton Kwesi Johnson, one of my heroes and one of the trustees of the George Padmore Institute, described the Institute as a crucial realisation of John La Rose's life's work. This is an important part of the legacy of John La Rose, an incredibly important one, and those trustees of that institute should be respected. And the trustees wrote that the renaming proposed in the way that it has been conceived and is being carried out is not one that John himself would have supported. And it is not in tune with his vision. Now, we are talking about changing the name to this person's name, right? So it's not simply about getting rid of one name, it's about what the name becomes. And I think that is also an important part of the strategic decision making. So this isn't just about an archaeology of the names of the roads and the places and the buildings. It's also what's the strategy we're going to take in order to decide on the name that will be replacing it. And if the institute, from which is the realization of John La Rose's life's work, don't agree that this should be done, then I think we need to take it very seriously. And in fact, one could actually argue it's quite insulting to override their views and their criticisms. And it's worth noting that the renaming of the Young Persons Bursary scheme in recent weeks was renamed as the John La Rose Award. And the same trustees who were incredibly critical of the manner in which the road name was being changed to John La Rose talked of being delighted and believed it is an approach, talking about the change to the John La Rose Award, an approach of which John himself would have approved. So my point is that there was a strategic need in terms of the way that we pursue this, but also really importantly, we can't override the desires of the legacy, those that are entrusted with that legacy and are custodians of that legacy, and just say, well, we don't care what you think, we're changing the name to that regardless. So I think, you know, there's a two-pronged approach to the strategy going forward. One of them is a strategic approach in which roads, Redvers, Buller or Black Boy, you know, and others, and who and what we change that name to. Thank you.
Thank you. Hang on, I've got quite a list of speakers here. Who's asking the point of clarification?
Sorry, a point of information there. What Councillor Carter did mention was that there was a disagreement amongst some members of the institute. If you get 10 people in the room, not everybody's going to agree with each other. But the family themselves were united behind this change. Right, every member of the family, there were emails in, letters to the committee saying, we the family, we the descendants, we agree and we support this. The fact that some members of the institute took a different view about the route to commemorating John La Rose is not a reason to be used to prevent the whole change happening.
Okay, that isn't a point of clarification, that we can't have everybody coming back answering every point that's been made by previous speakers. So I've got a list of speakers. I think we've also got Councillor Tucker wishes to speak. Yeah, do you want to join us now?
Thank you, Chair. You allowed Councillor Hakata 3 minutes to speak, so I hope you will allow me the same length. I'm a councillor for St Anne's Ward. I've lived in St Anne's Ward for many, many years, and it was one of the few shocking things that I noticed about Tottenham and my ward when I moved in to live here, and I've had that conversation with many people since. I spoke this evening with Martha Osamore, who's already been mentioned here, who spearheaded the campaign to change the name of the Black Boy pub, which is on the corner. There are some people who are pretending, and they should know better, that the name Black Boy Lane has no racist connotations. Martha is making it absolutely clear that this is completely inaccurate. It is a racist name. The Black Boy pub had a sign outside that pub, and I've seen the photographs, of a disgusting, vile, racist caricature of a black child wearing a grass skirt. And that was the sign of that pub. And that was a matter of shame that provoked people to campaign against the name of that pub, and they succeeded in getting it changed. The idea that we hold the community together by hanging on to a name of which we should be ashamed, which offends so many people in our area, is pure hypocrisy. And I do find it strange that the leader of an anti-racist council like Haringey Council has endorsed a report which effectively kicks the change of Black Boy Lane so far in, not just into the long grass, but effectively into orbit, puts it through such a set of processes, such a set of panels, that honestly it will never be seen again if you endorse this report. Can I mention two community organisations? One being my political party, the Labour Party. St Anne's branch of the Labour Party, a large community organisation in St Anne's, overwhelmingly, almost unanimously, supports this name change and wants it done as soon as possible. Tottenham Labour Party supports this name change and wants it done as soon as possible. I spoke tonight to Vivek from Stand Up to Racism, who has provided a statement. And I just wanted to make certain that people were aware of the strength of feeling. And what Vivek wanted me to make clear was that Stand Up to Racism believes that first of all, the original decision to postpone the change of name to Black Boy Lane, of Black Boy Lane, was a shameful decision, one of political cowardice and opportunism, and that were we to follow the recommendation made in the report today, we would be playing along and playing up to a Tory government agenda led by Boris Johnson, the so-called anti-woke agenda, which is harnessing people's prejudices, people's fears, and opposing the kind of change which we need to make in our borough. Can I say something else about La Rose Lane? The name of La Rose Lane in the consultation was the top name that came out that people supported. John La Rose is a fantastic example. He was a fighter against colonialism. He was a fighter for socialism and a fighter for anti-racism. And we couldn't choose a better name to commemorate, but to commemorate him as the kind of person who we should be looking up to and teaching people about in Haringey. The proposal to delay is a proposal never to do it effectively. It really is now or never. So I really do ask you, comrades and colleagues, let's seize this moment and make this change, which should have been made many, many years ago.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Amin. Did you want to come back?
I think large.
We can't hear online, Councillor Amin. We can't hear you online.
There's two things, actually, and practical points. I've made my points anyway earlier. One is, I think, the amendment that Councillor Ejiofor has suggested, as Mr. Prince said, he needs to have a look at, which is fine by me. I mean, and I think, you know, I'm seconding that motion, so I would be very glad if he could have a look at it, please, Chair. So if there's any amendments or any kind of tinkering with it, more than happy to look at that. Two, I think what was suggested earlier, and by the sound of it, the Lib Dem are also in favour of this move, which is to move forward with the original report, with the proposal for the changing of the name, because we're not actually saying you change the name. All we are saying is the original report, which proposed the change of the name, is the report that we stand by, and we want to take that report forward. Happens, and I think, and yep, absolutely. So, you know, the majority of us actually are in favour of this shift. I would just say to you, Councillor Mitchell, that if this change doesn't happen today, I think it's an absolute shameful act that we are doing today. And what I don't want is to repeat the shameful act of March the 17th.
Right, I had you down, Councillor Ibrahim. Is it any?
Yeah, I wanted something for noting in response to some of the remarks made by Councillor Hakata and Councillor Ejiofor. I think as a council we should do as much as we possibly can to avoid getting into kind of debates about what a particular kind of representative of a legacy would like and what another one would like. We should completely avoid that. It is not our place at all to say we think this organisation or this individual is the legitimate kind of legacy holder of a individual, and particularly to make remarks like I do not believe that a person who was passed, who we cannot speak for, no one can speak for, would not have wanted that. That is not our role. That is a complete and utter overstepping of our mark as a local authority. What we are here to decide is whether we are going to change a name and make a recommendation about what that name is, and which went for a process. I think ultimately, if this committee had the power in March to make the decision to kick it into the long grass, and had that power, I would say it is perfectly legitimate that this committee then has the power to actually say, no, actually, we're going to do it. I do not believe this committee has lost the powers it had in March 2020. Was it March 2020 or 2021? So if we still hold that same power, all we're saying is we are making the decision that that committee was unable to make. And I propose that we hold a vote on it as well.
Yes, I've got one more speaker. I would just make the point that the reference to family or other members is relevant in that the council has a policy on name changes which says that it has to have the support of the estate of the individual.
We shouldn't make observations or remarks about who they're. What I meant to say, because it's a response to an admonishment of what I just said.
No,
what I'm saying, Councillor Mitchell, if you'd let me finish. What I'm saying is we shouldn't make our own observation, as Councillor Hakata did, about the legacy and what somebody who has passed may or may not have wanted. I found that inappropriate.
We've all received communications from the George Padmore Institute. So Councillor Berriman, you also indicated you want to come back.
Well, I just thought we could have this brief interlude to find out if we can even do this.
Yeah, in terms of how we proceed. So first of all, I will ask if Charlotte Promey wants to make any further comments. But yes, we would normally have some views from legal and finance. I'm not clear what is being proposed on the support package. It talks about that it should be further explained and clarified. So I think we need to be clear whether that's going to be increased. Is that code for that? So first of all, I'll invite Charlotte Promey if she wishes to come back, and then maybe we need to take up Raymond Prince's suggestion of a very brief consideration of any legal and finance points. So Charlotte, do you want to respond to the debate at all?
I suppose I'd just say that for all the reasons outlined and for the importance of it, it's the reason that we're proposing taking an approach which is talking more to the community, contextualising what we're doing, understanding that we need to address the inequalities sitting alongside the name, and act in a sort of deeper, more profound way, I guess, as well as. And it's not to push it into the long grass. It's not to delay it. It's not to say no. It is to have a process which does aim to have those community conversations, really build on it. And the name change could well come through that process. We would see that it would, but to embed it then across the community. So I suppose I don't want it to come across that this is a process which doesn't do all the things that you across all the conversations have said are important. But I think it is that contextualisation, that sense of what next. And that we really keep this as a strong process that isn't about individual sites, but is really about a studied way of thinking about our local identities. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So before we adjourn, Perhaps Councillor Edgeworth, can you just clarify what your proposal is in relation to the support package on offer?
The support package went through a consultation with members, with broader consultees and with officers. They looked at what was reasonable, what was appropriate, but the committee did say that for one last time it was comfortable for that to be looked at again. I'm not preempting what that last look would be. But you know, there was a broad envelope within which this particular proposal and change was going to happen. I think just there is a formal amendment which I now know has made it along to our monitoring officer tonight. But I wanted to say a couple of things, specifically where it says, does the estate have support for the proposal? La Rose's sons, grandsons, great-grandchildren, their comments are part of the report that went on the 17th of March. They all support it. They all endorse it. The family is 100% behind it. The time limit in the amendment says that it says we should do this thing 3 months and 2 weeks. That's plenty of time to do all of the broader consultation that has been required. It was done in a lot less time before. In the midst of during the time of a pandemic, around the same sort of time. So there is still time to do the things that are necessary. Our next committee meeting is on the 1st of February, and the 1st of February is the date that is on there to say that we should that we should implement those changes. So there's plenty of time. There's plenty of existing research. There's the opportunity to go and have a conversation again. But ultimately, the issue is that this committee has the legal authority to take that decision. And where we are at the moment is there's an amendment on the table that asks this committee to make that decision.
Thanks. So it's 2 months and 2 weeks, not 3 months and 2 weeks. Yes, indeed. So are we taking up the suggestion of a very brief adjournment? So we'll be back with you, those watching online, as soon as possible, hopefully a few minutes. Okay, apologies for the delay. So formally what I'm proposing is that I will invoke Committee Standing Order 63 to suspend Committee Standing Order 18 in order to continue past 10 p.m. Is that agreed? Thank you. Okay. Now, we need to re-adjourn. I'm really hopeful it's going to be a very brief adjournment this time. And as soon as Raymond Prince is back, we can proceed. So we'll adjourn the meeting again. So I thought he was coming then, but no, I don't think he is. Okay, we will resume the meeting. So we're still on item 11. So I would like to invite Raymond Prince to advise.
So first and foremost, many thanks for giving me the headspace to have a think about this. I'm grateful. So where I'm at in terms of the advice is I think that this decision should be deferred to another meeting, which certainly as between officers and the chair, think is doable on the 23rd of November. And the thinking behind that is that there's material in the amendment put forward by Councillor Ejiofor that require officer consideration, not least from a finance perspective, to see if this is still doable as an option. And if it's approached in that way, I think it is possible to come back on the 23rd with a view in terms of whether we can proceed as Councillor Ejiofor is suggesting tonight or not. And so,
can we just have the legal advice first, please?
And so in anticipating a further question of me, I think that in my head, I can distinguish what happened on the last occasion in March from what I'm proposing tonight on the basis that in March, it wasn't a complete 360-degree turn in the sense that there wasn't a decision not to rename the road, merely to pause that process to allow for wider consultation to take place. Whereas tonight, it is more akin to a 360 on the basis that this amendment suggests that we implement the change, whereas what's before members in the report is something very distant from that. And so that would be my explanation as to why tonight is different to March. But as I say, the underlying advice is From a governance perspective, I think it is much safer, much better decision making if we pause tonight, come back on the 23rd, when officers will have been given an opportunity to consider the implications of this, and we can then, or sorry, the members can then make a decision in terms of next steps.
Thank you. So we're proposing to reconvene on the 23rd. Councillor Ejiofor?
So I'm just trying to understand what the legal advice is and what it means. And I note that the amendment looks to make a to set the statutory dates for the renaming on the 1st of February. Is that what the issue is? Or because we need to make a decision, right? Are you saying that on the 23rd we'll be able to make the decision that is requested within the amendment?
What I'm saying on the 23rd is we'll have an idea whether this is doable or not, from especially a finance perspective. And if the answer to that is yes, then we can discuss next steps to see whether your preferred implementation date of February is doable. Those questions will have answers by the 23rd, which isn't available to you tonight. So it would be an imperfect decision if one was made tonight, and would be obviously against my advice.
I'm conscious of the time, that we've still got another item to do. We've had the advice from the legal officer. We're not proposing to push. Can you just let me finish, please? We're not proposing. Yeah, I'm speaking. We're not proposing to kick it into the long grass, to use a phrase that has been used earlier. We're talking about reconvening in a week's time, where we can get the advice that we would normally have on any decision that we take from finance and legal. So can we keep this brief, please? Councillor Ibrahim.
Sorry, mine was a question to the monitoring officer, and my expectation is that when we obviously are given advice that we can question it. So I appreciate what you're saying, that obviously this would be a decision because it would have financial implications. You need to have some checks and balances against us making instant decisions about, you know, spending £100,000 that the council may not have. Okay, I totally appreciate that. Therefore, I do think that that is a doable proposal. However, I also would like advice on whether this committee can pass a motion in order to say that we support this change in principle, and for that, for when that decision comes back with the, so it's not a decision to do it, to say that we support this decision in principle. Please could you come back on the 23rd with the relevant financial implications, etc.
Yes.
Yes, Councillor Ibrahim, I'm grateful for your first set of comments. The decision will be taken on the merits on the night. That's the fundamental point. So yes, you can agree something in principle tonight, but at the end of the day, the final decision will be taken on the merits of the information that's before you on the night.
Can I just double check? Because obviously we have to be fully aware that we can't kind of predetermine a decision if we then subsequently get advice to say this is financially completely impossible or it's not legal to do it in this way. Then as long as we agree and everybody understands that we have to take whatever that financial or other form of legal advice on board and be prepared to accept that what we agree tonight is to task the officers to come back to us on the 23rd of November with a proposal of a way forward on how we can implement this, and then we would have to take into account all of the other quite rightful considerations that you put forward.
Right.
Slightly garbled motion, but I could put it into a form of words.
Right. There are a lot of hands going up again. We've had a huge debate on this already. Councillor Amin?
Now, my fear is that this will be another thing to put it further into the long grass. It was put in the long grass and it was mentioned that in that way, in that word, in those exact words in the meeting at the 17th of March. And it was very offensive that it was done, it was put in the long grass for a start, and it's shameful. But today I would like us to agree something formally, because I don't want to leave this meeting and be told that you can't do this again. And I don't want it to go, and I want to be able to give that news to a lot of black people in the organisations that I'm involved with, and to be able to say to people, we can hold our heads up because we've done what is right for this borough, not done what the previous committee did. Not properly well put, but I just want us to be absolutely clear about it and pass that motion today.
Can we be clear then what motion is now being proposed that we should?
Can I propose a form of words?
Yes.
Something very simple. I'll let other people speak first, and then I'll come back.
Right, Councillor Tabwell. Can you? Okay.
What I can say, Councillor, is it's not a motion that's been made in accordance with the Constitution.
Right, can we try and wrap this up? Right, Councillor Amin.
Be very short.
Sorry to interrupt, but apparently there's a sound problem.
Okay, it was really just a simple question to say the previous report had all this information, the finance report, the financial impact, what it meant for residents, what it meant for anybody else for that matter. It had both the legal advice and it had the financial information. So I don't understand what has changed since that report. It's been 6, 7 months or 8 months since it's been it was, tabled at this committee and ruled and pushed out. So what's changed? And for you to say now that there needs to be more financial information. So I'm a little bit anxious about whether this is an attempt actually to shift it back again to a place where it cannot be moved again.
I don't know what's changed, and that's the point. And so for the benefit of was it a week to the 23rd? I think it's prudent to wait the week, not put, I don't even know if Thomas is or anybody from finance is still on the line, not put colleagues on the spot to come up with answers to questions with all due respect to Councillor Registrar, could have been put in advance of tonight. And then there would have been a response tonight. So I don't know, Councillor Amin. And in terms of where I stand, completely neutral. I have no vested interest in this one way or the other. I can